Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, we're going to be talking about how to write about the rhetorical appeals of logos, ethos, and pathos. It's important to remember that choices create appeals. So as you're approaching a passage, if you start to notice appeals, ask yourself which choice is creating that appeal. And then as you transition to writing an essay, make sure you focus on the choice and then talk about the appeal it creates rather than only focusing on the appeal itself. First up is logos, and that is an appeal to logic or reason. I said that if you notice an appeal, you need to ask yourself which choice is creating that appeal. So here are some common choices that create a logical appeal. So first of all, you might notice facts or statistics because those tend to be very logical. You could also notice that the speaker or writer is making a comparison to prove a point. That tends to be logical as well. They could also be including examples, or they could even have something called a conditional sentence, which is an if-then sentence. They could use deductive or inductive reasoning or syllogisms. The syllogisms are less common, but they do appear sometimes. And then also, they could use a counterclaim and rebuttal or concession and refutation to try to develop their argument in a logical way. Once you've identified the choice that creates the logical appeal, you've essentially made your claim. So now you need to prove that claim with evidence. So you want to ask yourself, what evidence best demonstrates this logical choice? Then you want to start to think about your commentary, which is your analysis. It's your own interpretation and original thought. And so you want to start to ask yourself why and how questions. Why does the writer make this choice at this point in the passage? How does this choice help the writer develop his or her argument? To write a more effective rhetorical analysis essay, we want to try to avoid using simpler phrases like uses logos. Because first of all, logos is a Greek term, so we want to at least say the word logic instead of logos if possible, but uses is a relatively weak verb, and so we want to try to be a bit more rhetorically accurate. So to do this, we need to think about the choice that's creating the logical appeal. So I've given you some sentence frames here that have stronger verbs in them to help you write about logos more effectively. Depending on the passage that you're writing about, you might want to or need to alter these sentence frames a little bit, and that's totally fine. The idea, though, is to make sure that we are writing about the choice as precisely as possible, because just saying uses logos is incredibly vague. We want to identify exactly what the writer is doing and then explain why they're doing it. I apologize in advance that this slide is a little bit hard to read. I was trying to include plenty of information for you guys, but the writing is a little bit small. But basically, I wanted to model the process of identifying the choice, identifying the evidence, and then starting to examine why the writer made that choice. So you can see that I have my observations. For this example, I'm using the Florence Kelley passage. So Florence Kelley begins her argument by citing facts about child labor. She also provides examples of unjust child labor laws in multiple states. So that's what she's doing. Then I had to ask myself, what's the best evidence for this? So in this part, you could either use a direct quote or you could paraphrase, but I just made a few bullet points of evidence that I would want to include if I were writing an essay. Then I asked myself some questions because I wanted to figure out why she was citing those facts and those examples. I also wanted to figure out why she was doing this at the beginning of her speech. Next up is pathos, and that's an appeal to emotion. Now, one of the most important things we need to recognize about an emotional appeal is that you need to specify which emotion the writer is appealing to, because just saying that the writer appeals to emotion is incredibly vague. This is not an entirely inclusive list, but here are some of the more common emotions that a writer or speaker might appeal to. So we have fear, nostalgia, sympathy or empathy, patriotism, and hope. Once you identify the specific emotion that the writer appeals to, you want to ask yourself how you knew the writer was appealing to that emotion. So is it through the word choice that he or she is using and the tone it creates? Is it through imagery, details, description, anecdotes? Any of those things could be a technique or a choice that the writer uses to include an emotional appeal. Once we've identified the specific emotion and the choice behind it, we want to ask ourselves why the writer is making that choice to convey that emotion. We also want to think about why they're making that choice at that particular point in the passage and what the desired effect or result is. So what are they trying to make the audience think or feel or believe? We also want to be mindful of the prompt that we're actually answering. So with the stable wording for AP Lang, students will be asked about the argument, purpose, or message. So let's say we're being asked about the message. We want to ask ourselves how this particular emotional appeal helps convey that message. And just as a bonus tip, whenever you're talking about the purpose, argument, or message, you want to make sure that you very clearly identify what that purpose, argument, or message is. Don't just say to convey the message. We need to know what the message is. And even if you've already said it somewhere else in your essay, always make sure you're being as specific as possible. Tell us what the message is. Just as we talked about with logos, with pathos, we want to also avoid saying uses pathos because it's incredibly vague. So here are some sentence frames that you might be able to use to convey the choice and the emotional appeal. And just as a side note, if you really like these sentence frames and you want to see more of them for AP Language, I'll link some resources in the description box below. Now let's talk about how we put this all together. So we're going to continue with Florence Kelly as our example. And we previously talked about how she included facts and examples to create a logical appeal at the beginning of her speech. She needed to prove that child labor was a serious problem in the US at the time. But as the speech continues, she shifts from logical appeals to emotional appeals. So how do we know this? Well, if you read the speech, which I highly recommend, by the way, she starts to vividly describe the working conditions that these little girls must suffer through. And the reason she does this is to appeal to the emotions of her audience because her audience is predominantly women. So they'll feel sympathy for the little girls, they'll feel pity for the little girls, and that'll make them want to help these girls. Now let's talk about ethos. Ethos can either be an appeal to credibility or in some cases, it's an appeal to morality. For the purposes of this video, though, we're going to talk about how to write about ethos when a writer or speaker is appealing to credibility. How do we know that a writer appeals to credibility? Well, these first two bullet points sort of go hand in hand because oftentimes when a writer is trying to bolster or strengthen his or her own credibility, chances are you're going to see a lot of personal pronouns, I, me, and my. And because of this, chances are they're probably talking about their own personal experience or their actions, so what they've done, or their authority on a topic or expertise in order to bolster that credibility. You could also, in some cases, notice testimonials, or they could be citing someone else's experience to bolster their credibility. So if the person is not an expert themselves, they could turn to experts in order to add credibility to their argument. Let's look at a couple examples of times when speakers have appealed to credibility. So in the first example, it's when the speaker appeals to his own credibility. In this case, it's from President Bush's 9/11 speech. And during that speech, he talks about what he has done as president in order to make sure that things are secure and that justice will be served. Now, in the bottom example, we have evidence of a speaker appealing to credibility by citing somebody else's expertise. So this example comes from President Clinton's speech following the Oklahoma City bombing. Now, because President Clinton has never lost anybody in that severe of a circumstance, he actually references somebody else who has and gives her words of advice because that would better resonate with the crowd who is mourning the loss of their family members and their community members. Here are some questions you can ask yourself if you notice an appeal to credibility. So first of all, why is the speaker or writer qualified to speak or write about this topic? You could also ask yourself, how does the writer's experience or testimony help achieve the purpose, convey the message, or develop the argument? Because remember, we want to tie it back to the prompt as well. And just as we asked ourselves why the writer is qualified to write or speak about this topic in the instances where they appeal to their own credibility, we want to ask ourselves the opposite question if we notice that they are citing somebody else's advice, experience, or testimony to build their credibility. So why are they including that person's experience instead of their own? What makes that person more qualified? And how does it help the writer build his credibility to further his argument, message, or purpose? Here are some sentence frames that you are welcome to use to write about credibility. As with the other appeals, you want to be as specific as possible and you want to avoid the phrase uses ethos. If you are an AP Lang teacher or student, make sure that you are subscribed to this channel. Click the bell to turn those notifications on. That way you don't miss any future content. And also don't forget to check out the description box below for more resources. Until next time, guys, happy writing!